Kneeling before the young man, Edward III, the 18-year-old King of England, Edward Balliol, let's be honest, felt out of place. But the times dictated harsh rules, and without this act, he had no chance of reclaiming his rightful Scottish throne. So, he loudly and clearly paid homage to the King of England, ensuring that there was no doubt about his allegiance. With Edward's troops at his disposal, he could now head north to finally drive the hated Bruces away. This story had tangled itself long before the year 1330. It was then that Edward Balliol pledged his loyalty to the King of England. Almost 40 years prior to this homage, the direct line of Scottish monarchs had come to an end, and several families laid claim to the throne. The loudest contenders were the Bruces and the Balliols. Both dynasties were closely related to the extinct line. Both possessed power and wealth, and both were eager for control. In the royal race, John Balliol initially emerged victorious. The crown was given to him. But intrigue and military intervention soon elevated the Bruces. John tried for a time to regain his lost position, but when he realized he could no longer expect support, he left with his family for France. The deposed king's eldest son, Edward Balliol, naturally yearned for revenge. He witnessed his father's despair and utter helplessness in changing their fate, and he dreamed of the day he would wear the crown of Scotland himself, reclaiming all their lost lands. And he was not alone in his thirst for vengeance. The Bruces, having taken the throne, expelled all of Balliol's supporters from the kingdom, leaving many without any possessions. Thus, in London and its surroundings at the beginning of the 14th century, a group of disinherited individuals settled. These were offspring of noble families, proud, bold, deeply aggrieved, and ready for decisive action. All they needed was a leader. The arrival of the 47-year-old Edward Balliol at the court of King Edward III sparked intense interest among the disinherited. The older generation remembered the boy from Edinburgh Castle. Their descendants, of course, did not, making them all the more curious to see him. What if he turned out to be the one they could trust? Balliol's arrival came at a fortuitous moment. Not long before, King Robert Bruce had passed away, leaving behind a 6-year-old son as his heir. Without a strong hand in Scotland, chaos had once again ensued. It was the perfect time to invade the kingdom. Edward Balliol did not disappoint the Scots in London. He declared that his primary goal was to reclaim his father's crown, and that he was ready to pay homage to Edward of England as his lord. In exchange, he expected military support, and the king agreed. 1,500 warriors, including the disinherited, landed on the shores of Scotland. Anticipating an attack, the Royal Scottish forces set out to meet Edward. In the Battle of Dapping Moor, Balliol emerged victorious. Such incredible luck in his very first battle inspired both Edward and his supporters. In September of the year 1332, Balliol was crowned as the ruler of Scotland and Scone. Many barons were quick to rally to his side. They remembered how ruthlessly Robert Bruce dealt with his opponents and were not keen to test the new ruler's severity on their own skin. The young King David had been swiftly moved away from the capital. His life was now in grave danger. Meanwhile, the clans loyal to the underage monarch, led by Archibald Douglas, struck a blow against Balliol. It was so powerful and, above all, unexpected that Edward was forced to retreat. The newly crowned king was literally pushed out of his own kingdom. Once again, Balliol called for help from the King of England. According to medieval customs, a vassal could seek support from his lord. After all, that was the purpose of paying homage. The loyalty of a vassal was exchanged for the king's strength. To sweeten the deal, Edward promised the English monarch to reconsider the borders between their territories, of course in favor of London. This likely played a crucial role, as the English king sent his troops. Now Archibald Douglas, the chief defender of King David, was forced to flee. The young monarch himself moved to France, where he was warmly welcomed by King Philip VI of Valois. The boy was provided with Chateau Gallard as a temporary residence. Meanwhile, on the other side of the English Channel, Balliol could begin his reign. Everything was set in motion to restore the disinherited to their ancestral estates. The ruler began to fulfill his promises. Thus, David Strathbogie received the earldom of Athol, and Henry Beaumont was granted the earldoms of Moray and Buchan. However, Balliol also needed to satisfy the English king who had helped him regain the throne. As payment for his support, he had to cede the Isle of Man, Berwick-upon-Tweed, and several other territories in the south. Balliol and the disinherited failed to consider one crucial fact. The Scots were unwilling to make any concessions to the King of England, let alone recognize his suzerainty. Discontent was growing in the country, and more barons were speaking out in their castles, calling for the return of the former King David and the expulsion of Balliol, who had allowed Scotland to be plundered. These voices of dissent were eagerly relayed to the young monarch. Sensing the support of the clans, David's supporters launched a new offensive against the English and Edward Balliol. The Civil War flared up with renewed intensity. A battle took place in the woods of Colbline, where Balliol's commander, David Strathbogie, made a fatal mistake. His army was scattered throughout the forest and picked off one by one. Edward Balliol lacked experienced military leaders and had no one to replace Strathbogie. As a result, he began to lose battle after battle. He made one last attempt to appeal to the English king, but Edward was unable to come to his aid. He was preparing for another war, aiming to reclaim the French throne. He simply couldn't stretch himself thin. Left without support and cornered, Balliol fled Scotland. Back home, the young King David immediately began to assess the damages from the Civil War. He first convened Parliament and then announced that taxes would need to be raised significantly. Unsurprisingly, this did not sit well with many. Additionally, he planned to reclaim the lands that had been ceded to the English crown under Balliol's decision. These grand plans required immense resources and manpower. The Scots went on the offensive at a time when the English were fiercely engaged in battle on French soil. They hoped that there were no well-fortified cities or significant forces left in the northern lands. However, the Scots suffered a crushing defeat at Neville's Cross. King David II was captured by the English, and Edward Balliol immediately rushed to claim the vacant throne in Edinburgh. This expedition became his last, a final attempt to reclaim his father's throne. It ended in failure. Time and again, Edward had given up on his dream, but he always returned. This time, however, he chose not to. He had grown older and too weary. In the year 1356, having finally surrendered, Balliol signed his abdication of the Scottish crown. He passed on his inheritance to the English king. Balliol had no children. He died 11 years later. In exchange for the crown of Scotland, Edward III granted Balliol a lifelong pension that allowed the former ruler to live in relative comfort.